Thank you, Gregory. Thank you, Francois and Martina, for organizing this really interesting conference around a very interesting set of connections, possible connections. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah, good. So I had more or less successfully avoided talking about consciousness and physicalism up until now, but I was lured into this. I will start with talking about what we're calling, I guess, Kripke-style transparency, and look at an argument that Philip Goff has developed using that notion against a posteriori physicalism. So physicalism is the view that to be in a certain type of phenomenal state, say that of being in pain, is to be in a certain type of physical state, say C fibers firing, conventional. So physicalism, the property of being in pain, is the property of having certain C fibers firing. Now, I call a somewhat a priori physicalist, SAP, holds that pain as C fibers firing is knowable a priori. How? Well, the closest you would get would be to say that, you know, a priori, by mere reflection on the concepts involved, that P is the pain is the property of playing a certain kind of causal role. Typical causal role makes you want to avoid it and is caused in certain ways and so on. In my terminology, it's what we're saying is that it's epistemically analytic of pain that it plays a certain causal role. Now these days, so what happens is that you then discover empirically that what plays this causal role is the C fibers firing. Now, I think these days most everyone agrees that this type of physicalism founders on 2A. That is, it's simply not true or that our concept of pain is just that of something that plays a certain causal role. In any case, that's not the concept of pain that we exercise when we think of pain experientially in terms of how it feels. So when we think of pain experientially, we think of it in terms of what it feels like to have it, and this is what's now referred to as the phenomenal concept of pain. Now, although there are lots of questions about exactly how phenomenal concepts should be construed that people in this room have contributed to, I think we can confidently say that pain's typical causal role in humans is A, not a part of the phenomenal concept, and B, that it's at most a contingent fact that it has the typical causal role that we experience it as having. And this, of course, is well illustrated by David Lewis's concept of mad pain, where he imagines somebody who is capable of experiencing exactly the same kind of sensation as we do, but has a totally different response to it, snaps his fingers and does mathematics, I think is what Lewis imagined. Now, the fully a posteriori physicalist, FAP, as I'm referring to him, seeks to accommodate the observation that phenomenal concepts are not concepts of causal roles. She agrees that our phenomenal concept of pain conceives of pain in terms of its characteristic feel and not in terms of a causal role. But she insists that it could still be true that the referent of this phenomenal concept just is C fibers firing, some purely physical state, and that this fact can only be discovered empirically. Now, this gives the FAP a neat way of dealing with Jackson's Mary, as very nicely discussed by Martina in her SEP article. That is, it allows the a posteriori physicalist to say, when Mary comes out of her monochromatic room, I hope everybody knows about Jackson's Mary here, she comes out of her monochromatic room, and she gains a new concept of visualizing red, seeing red. I'm avoiding the locution seeing red so as to not raise issues about whether, you know, it's a factive state, so just visualizing red. And when she leaves the monochromatic room, and then she acquires a new belief, but she learns no new fact and encounters no new property. The property of visualizing red is just the physical property she was previously familiar with, just now experienced and thought about under a new guise. So that's the story we're told using the phenomenal concept in order to deal with what to say about Mary. Because if Mary were acquiring new information, new factual information, then there is a problem for physicalism, because after all, she was supposed to know all the physical facts, and yet she's learning some new facts, and so it can't, well, not all the facts could have been physical. Now, Philip Goff, along with others, has objected to FAP roughly as follows. FAP is committed to a false account of our phenomenal concepts. In particular, FAP is committed to holding that our phenomenal concepts are what he says radically opaque. However, our phenomenal concepts are at least somewhat transparent, and maybe even fully transparent, hence FAP is false. So that's the form of the argument. And I want to say that although I understand the temptation behind wanting to mount this kind of argument, and I don't write as a card-carrying physicalist at all, I will argue that this particular argument fails because it equivocates on the relevant notions of transparency and opacity. But I think that there is very much something obviously in the vicinity of what Philip Goff is getting at, and at the end I will try to put it in ways that I think get around some of the difficulties that I'm going to pose for him. Well, what does it mean for a concept to be transparent? And Philip gives the following definitions. You know, a concept is transparent when it reveals the full nature of its referent. Where the referent is a property, the concept reveals what it is for an object to have that property. Translucent, a translucent property reveals part, but not all of the nature of its referent. A mildly opaque concept does not reveal essential properties of the referent, but does reveal accidental features which uniquely identified in the actual world, possibly like water's causal role. And a radically opaque concept reveals neither essential nor accidental properties of its referent. And the specific anti-physicalist argument that Philip mounts is that FAP has to say that our phenomenal concepts of pain are radically opaque. However, our phenomenal concept of pain is at least translucent, hence FAP is false. So that's the form of the argument. So my problem will be figuring out what notion of transparency and opacity we can formulate that would make this argument go through. I'll mostly just work with radically opaque and translucent. So Philip gives the following examples. He says, I know a priori at least something of what it is for an object to be spherical in Euclidean geometry. That is, I know it's for that object to have all points on its surface equidistant from its center. So, by contrast, he gives the following example as an example of an opaque context. He says, suppose Kev and I are playing a fun game called Guess Which Property Kev is Thinking About. As it happens, the property Kev is thinking about is the feeling of pain. I am clueless, but I try to be clever. Of course, I know which property you're thinking about. It's for it to be such that it has the property you are thinking of the property Kev is thinking about right now, where I use that as a rigid designator. Of course, I've managed to denote the property Kev is thinking about, but there's a clear sense in which I do not know what it is for an object to have that property. Of course, I say, of course, I know what it is for an object to have that property, blah, blah, blah. Disquoting again, roughly, and he says, but this is just more, this is more trickery. So the concept of the property Kev is thinking about right now is opaque. And as I said, I think Philip thinks it's just obvious that phenomenal concepts of pain are not opaque in this sense. He says at least something of what it is for something to feel pain is knowable a priori. It's because reflection on pain in terms of how it feels reveals something of what it's like to feel pain that I'm moved to help those in pain. And he emphasizes that this is not just meant to be some mysterious insight into reality, but rather just an intuition about the concept. Okay. And I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to whether what's going on here is merely insight into concepts or whether something else might be going So in saying that he knows at least something of what it is for something to feel pain, Philip is referring to the typical, I guess, unpleasantness of pain. And while it's not all that important here, let me just say a few words about why I think that I don't think that the typical unpleasantness of pain is part of the concept of pain, phenomenally conceived. Philip says that unless he knew a priori, by mere reflection on the concept of pain, that pain is unpleasant, we wouldn't then be able to explain his motivation to help someone who is in pain. But I don't know why that should be true. That is, why does knowledge of the typical unpleasantness of pain have to be a priori? Why couldn't it be something that you learn empirically from your own case and rationally assume will obtain for others? And I'm told that there are people with pain asymbolia who feel pain without finding it unpleasant. For them, clearly, unpleasantness isn't part of their phenomenal concept. And acknowledging all of this, by the way, is perfectly consistent with my knowing purely introspectively that my pain is unpleasant, when I have it. Furthermore, I think it's hard to construe unpleasantness as purely phenomenal. That is, hard to believe that something is really unpleasant unless there's some motivation to be rid of it. But causal role wasn't supposed to be part of the phenomenal concept. So and in any event, I think it would be a mistake in this context to rely heavily on our alleged knowledge that pain is unpleasant, because that would be at best a feature of this particular case and not a phenomenal concept quite generally. That is, if you now, all the problems for a posteriori physicalism can be raised using visualizing red, where there's clearly no valence one way or the other. At least not as part of the concept. I happen to like visualizing geranium red. But so if we turn to the phenomenal concept of pain and ask in what sense that it is translucent, what do we know a priori about the referent of this phenomenal concept on the basis of reflection on the concept alone? Well, what we know a priori about the feeling of pain, based on reflection on the phenomenal concept, is that it's a certain kind of feeling. You can add unpleasant feeling if you like, namely pain. But isn't this trivial in the way in which saying that I know what property Kev is thinking about right now because I know that it's the property Kev is thinking about right now is also trivial? In both cases, I am basically disquoting, or whatever the equivalent practice is for operation is for concepts. In the case of the property Kev is thinking about right now, which I'll abbreviate as Kev, I know that it's the property Kev is thinking about right now, and in the case of phenomenal pain, I know that it's the property of being a pain. But the ability to give more than this kind of trivial specification of the referent of a given concept was said to be the mark of opacity in the case of Kev. So there's a question about how Philip can claim that phenomenal concepts are translucent in contrast with the allegedly opaque case of the property Kev is thinking about right now. Now, you might think this question is unfair, this line of thought is unfair. After all, in the Kev case, I can just disquote the concept, the property Kev is thinking about right now, without having any idea which property Kev is thinking about right now. Of course, I have to understand the ingredient notions, otherwise my disquoting wouldn't be competent or effective. But provided I have that grasp, I can just disquote without having any idea which property Kev is thinking about right now. But so the reply would continue in the pain case. I can't just disquote the concept of pain and say it's the property of being in pain, whatever it is. I have to have an experiential encounter with the property of being in pain and know about it in that way. But I think this misses the point, because of course, you have to have an experiential encounter with pain in order to disquote competently, because that's what it takes to grasp the phenomenal concept of pain. In other words, it's part of the possession conditions. In both cases, what you've got are concepts that you can only disquote competently if you satisfy the possession conditions. And in both cases, the possession condition in the Kev case is one thing, and the possession condition in the case of a phenomenal concept requires an experiential encounter. However, once you satisfy those conditions, you can say competently that its referent is the property Kev is thinking about right now, and similarly in the pain case. So, look, as far as I can see, what's going on here is that there is a significant philosophical challenge that needs to be taken seriously, which is that, and can't be met simply by saying that the disquotational specifications are trickery. That is, the Kev example shows that there is always an a priori way of saying what the referent of a concept is, namely by disquoting, without placing some restriction on the vocabulary with which the referent is to be specified. It seems to me that all concepts will count as at least translucent. So then the question becomes, is there some way of articulating a restriction on how the referent needs to be specified, which will discriminate in an interesting way between transparent and opaque concepts while letting the anti-physicalist argument go through? And this is what I am doubting. I can think of two types of restriction. By the way, when did we start? If I can keep track.
We start at 15.
9:15? Okay. So I can think of two types of restriction on the vocabulary with which the referent is to be specified, if it's not just to repeat the original vocabulary. The first one we can call an other type of vocabulary restriction. That is, for a concept to be translucent in this sense, the nature of the reference needs to be specifiable a priori, not merely by disquoting, but by drawing on a distinct type of vocabulary drawn from a different domain than that of the original. For example, if the concept in question is normative, then the reference should be specifiable a priori in non-normative descriptive terms. And if the concept in question is phenomenal, then the reference should be specifiable a priori in non-phenomenal, e.g. causal or physical terms. So that's the OVT, the other vocabulary restriction. You can think of a weaker one, an other words restriction. For a concept to be translucent in this sense, the nature of the referent needs to be specifiable a priori, not merely by disquoting, but with the use of some other words, not themselves dependent on the original word, although not ones necessarily drawn from a distinct type of vocabulary. Now, clearly, if a concept is OVT, other vocabulary, transparent, it will be OWT, but not the other way around. I do think that each type of restriction ends up specifying an interesting distinction between transparent and opaque concepts, but I think not in ways that help the anti-physicalist argument as far as I can tell. So let's take the first stronger restriction, OVT. If a concept is to be OVT, it should be possible to specify its reference nature a priori in terms of a vocabulary drawn from another domain. On this reading, Kev will count as opaque, of course, but by this criterion, spherical will also count as opaque, since the vocabulary with which the referent is specified is itself drawn from the vocabulary of geometry. That's the concept sphericality that was given as an example of a transparent concept. And now you may worry that OVT is such a strong restriction that, in fact, no concept counts as other vocabulary transparent. However, I think it's clear that at least some concepts are OVT. For example, the thick ethical concept of bravery implies that when it's correctly applied to someone, the person behaved in a way that was personally risky, or that's a descriptive term. So, or saying that some bodily organ, that it has a certain function, implies that it was selected for that feature. So the notion of an OVT is by no means empty, and I think showing that some concepts are not other vocabulary transparent can have interesting implications. For example, I think a strong case can be made for the claim that the thin ethical concepts, good, bad, ought, ought not, has reason to, has no reason to, are not other vocabulary transparent. They are opaque relative to this criterion. That is to say, you cannot derive by mere reflection on the thin ethical concepts what act types described descriptively they apply to. Right? For example, let me go into this a little bit as an example of how a Kripke-style opacity thesis construed in this way can have interesting philosophical consequences. So suppose we have a canonical set of thin normative concepts. The question about OVT translucency is whether mere reflection on these concepts reveals to you which act types descriptively characterized fall under them. For example, does mere reflection on wrong reveal to you that it is wrong to inflict suffering on an innocent person just for fun? Is that mere reflection on the ingredient concept? Now, this no abuse principle, which I just cited, is an example of what I call a substantive normative principle, moral principle. It has the form, if X is D, then X is N, where D is a canonical descriptive predicate and N is a canonical normative predicate. And when we seek moral knowledge, I think we're seeking knowledge of these kinds of principle. Now, one thing on which most theorists agree is that thin ethical words have a characteristic normative role, one that enables them to carry out their normative functions. That's to say that something is wrong. So, for example, to say that something is wrong is to commit oneself to criticizing it, commit to avoiding it, commit to having negative emotions when you experience it, and so on. So the question about OVT translucency is equivalent to the question whether these normative concepts contain anything more than this normative role, or whether they contain doctrine about what falls under them descriptively characterized. Now, Moore's claim in his open question argument was that the answer to any such question is always no. That is, although we do know that a principle like no abuse is true, we do not know this merely on the basis of the concepts involved. And if you ask, well, why was Moore so confident that no such claim could be analytic in that sense? There is, of course, the evidence that principles like no abuse are intelligibly debatable. Right? That is to say, they seem like this is something you could argue about, unlike arguing about whether squares are four-sided. But although this is often used, in fact, including in this literature, as a guide to failure of analyticity, that is, when you can intelligibly doubt something, it's not an infallible guide, because there could be hidden analyticities. That is, there could be things that look to you like they're intelligibly debatable, but they are, in fact, analytically true. So it's at best a fallible guide. Still, I believe, though I won't go into this in great detail here, that we can show that Moore was right, ultimately. And we can show this because we can see that when somebody raises a skeptical problem about a certain normative principle, we are not satisfied with semantical solutions to that normative skepticism. So, for example, we all understand the skepticism that says inductive reasoning is not epistemically justified. Okay. And we understand the skeptic who says, yeah, it's actually counter-induction that is epistemically justified. So that shows you this far that it is an intelligibly debatable thing. And the question is whether that conceals a deep hidden analyticity or not. And the fact is that, we can show that it's just, if somebody came along and says, as they did in the 50s, this is just what we mean by justified reasoning. Induction is just what we mean by justified reasoning. That this would not help the skeptical problem go away, because somebody could just come back and say, okay, let me imagine a notion of justification star that has exactly the same normative role as justification of recommending, criticizing, and so on and so forth, but where either induction is not built into it or a counter-induction is built into it. And then you'd have to give me an answer for why it is that I should care more about justification than about justification star. And if you say to me, well, obviously you should prefer justification because justification star incorporates a false principle of induction, namely counter-induction, you will have shown yourself to have had access to the truth about these matters that is not merely analytic, because it had to be based on something other than some conceptual remark, because it's a conflict between concepts which can't be settled conceptually. So this is why I think that Moore had a very deep insight that he couldn't quite translate into an argument that everybody accepted, but that all substantive normative truths are not analytic. Okay. Let's ask what would follow from this if this were granted. And of course, you know, the metaphysical thesis that all moral properties are not physical properties does not follow, right? Because this is just an epistemological thesis about what you're in a position to know merely on the basis of reflection on the concept. Not even the epistemological thesis that all normative principles are not a priori would follow, because in showing that these things are not epistemically analytic, it's left open either that they are empirical or that they're synthetic a priori. And in fact, my own view is that this is what is shown by these arguments, that normative principles are synthetic a priori, and that this is one example of the interest of an OVT version of concept translucency. So if you know, in other words, showing that they're not transparent in this way has this consequence. But of course, if we apply this to the phenomenal case, all that ends up happening is that FAP is committed to phenomenal concepts being not OVT. But that we already knew. In other words, all that happens is when you show that phenomenal concepts are not OVT transparent, is that physicalism could not be an analytic truth, and that was already something that we were trying to get away from. But what if we move to the weaker OWT? Well, once again, Kev will come out opaque on this one, but spherical will come out translucent. But even on this much weaker construal, what reason is there to think that phenomenal concepts will be intuitively translucent? To be translucent in this sense, you'd have to be able to give an, in other words, characterization of any phenomenal concept, but there's no intuitive reason to think that you should be able to give an account of the reference of visualizing geranium red in other words. In other words, of all the concepts which may have to be taken to be primitive, not definable in other words, phenomenal concepts are surely among the most plausible candidates. But that is what an OWT restricted notion of transparency would be tracking. It would be tracking the question whether there is a, in other words, definition of the concept or not. So, and that's not particularly going to help with the anti-physicalist arguments. Now, so look, let me sum this bit up. If there were any water, that would be nice. I think, and Philip will tell us, I'm sure, in a minute, otherwise, but I think he's assuming that it's obvious that there is some intuitive sense in which a concept is or is not transparent, one that is between mere disquotational specification and the notions of OWT and OVT. And the challenge is to say what that intermediate notion is. without it, we don't have a way of prosecuting this particular kind of argument. Now, let me turn to saying, so as the late, great Saul Kripke used to say, one has the considerable feeling. One has the considerable feeling that qualia are a problem for physicalism, and that we ought to be able to say what that problem is, and that it is somewhere in the vicinity of the ideas that Philip was working with, but somehow those particular formulations seem to me to run into the problems that I mentioned. I will now try a different way of getting at this issue. And who knows, maybe in the end they're not all that far apart, but they seem far apart because they seem subject to different considerations. Okay, so one way of putting it is, I think what Philip, you remember Philip was very insistent that he is only talking about concepts, he is not talking about the world. And this is a very familiar thing that philosophers do, because they're very afraid of being accused of having a spooky epistemology. And so the only safe thing is when I talk a priori or introspectively, I'm just talking about my concept, I'm not talking about anything in the real world. You know, in doing this, they forget that absolutely everything is spooky, as far as I can see. I mean, time is spooky, you know, normativity is spooky. So direct intuitive insight into properties is relatively tame by comparison. But look, let me think of the case of water, which is supposed to be the inspiration for a fully a posteriori physicalist. The case of water seems to illustrate impeccably how two concepts, water and H2O, could be utterly distinct from one another and yet end up having the same referent, a referent, moreover, that can only be discovered a posteriori. But in the water case, we fix the reference. Now, I'm going to do a lot of attributing sort of semantics and semantical thoughts to people, but this is, you know, this is called as-if semantics. You attribute certain rich things, but there is an underlying supervenience base that one can explicate. In the water case, we fix the reference of water not through its essential properties, but through its accidental properties. Moreover, we know that that's what we're doing. We assume that there is some underlying micro-constitution here whose individuation is given in some purely physical terms that we may not even know what they are. We pick out that stuff by saying it's to be whichever kind of stuff it is that plays a certain type of causal role. We know that that causal role is an accidental property of water and need not occur whenever water does, right? There'd be no contradiction in supposing that there are worlds where water exists but does not have its typical earthly causal role, either because it's in vaporous form or whatever. Mad water, you could call this, on analogy with Lewis's mad pain. What the description gives is not the meaning of water, but rather what Kripke called in one of the great innovations of the philosophy of language, its reference fixer. This is an associated description that helps determine the reference of a word without giving its meaning. The associated description can only be a reference fixer because, as I say, it doesn't characterize water through its essential properties. We don't really know anything about them at this stage of introducing the word, but only through its accidental properties. Now, how does reference work in the phenomenal case? Mary comes out of her monochromatic room and visualizes geranium red for the first time. We're told she forms a phenomenal concept of visualizing red for the first time. But what's this concept like and how does that happen? Well, she could have done what we do with water. She could have thought, this visualizing red state is just some accidental way in which some underlying stuff is being presented to me. Let visualizing red be a name for whatever the underlying stuff is. But she doesn't do that, you see. Instead, she seems to think, the state of visualizing red is a phenomenal state. It's essentially individuated by how it feels or looks. I want a name for a state whose essence is this appearance, so that anything that feels this way is a state of visualizing red, and anything that's a red visualizing will feel or look this way. Hence, I will fashion my concept of phenomenal visualizing red in such a way that anything, no matter what its cause, will count as a state of visualizing red if it looks like this. And you see here the individuation of the state precedes the formation of the concept and shapes it. Now, this, of course, is what causes the problem for physicalism, because in the water case, you see, it must be possible for us to, for there to be such a thing as fool's water, okay, something that looks like water, but isn't water. This will be true of any physical property. It's metaphysically possible for there to be fake examples, because the superficial appearances are one thing. But in the phenomenal case, there can be no such thing as a fool's visualizing red. Anything that looks like a red visualizing is a red visualizing. If we add that this state of visualizing red also has a physical essence, we are now in danger of having two seemingly very different properties, individuated in very different ways, competing for the role of the essence of visualizing red. On the physicalist individuation, it should be possible to get an instance of fool's red visualizing, since it should be possible to generate something with the phenomenology of visualizing red via other physical means. This may not be nomologically possible, but it sure looks metaphysically possible. On the phenomenal individuation, it's impossible to get a fool's visualizing of red on this way of individuating the properties. It doesn't matter how the state is caused. Now, you might be concerned that on this way of running the argument, I have begged the question against the a posteriori physicalist. David's going, yes. For I have been talking about the property of visualizing red and about a phenomenal way of individuating that property. But isn't the whole point of the phenomenal strategy to say that when Mary comes out of the monochromatic room, she doesn't encounter a new property, she just forms a new concept of an old property? But it seems to me there's no way to explain why the phenomenal concept is the way it is without talking about the property of visualizing red and about how it is phenomenally individuated. It's that decision that locks you in. Unless Mary thought of herself as encountering a new property, one with its own individuation conditions, she would be careful not to individuate it in a way that's potentially inconsistent with its being some unknown physical property. You'd be nuts to individuate any physical property constitutively in terms of how it looks, right? Because that's not going to individuate it right. But here, that's what this subject seems to be doing with impunity. And what can that suggest except that we're not talking about something with a backside, so to speak. And that's why I feel comfortable individuating this way. But once you do, the tension between these things, you need a metaphysical guarantee that they won't pull you in two different directions. Okay, well, so this is my attempt to say what in this nexus of issues constitutes a problem for a posteriori physicalism And I think I'll just stop here.
Thank you.